Welcome to Wellness Fixes the Pod, a by Maven media production, where we believe you deserve real education from real experts delivered in a way you can actually use. I'm Dr. Kelsy Vick, your board-certified orthopedic doctor of physical therapy, and this podcast was built for the girl who is done feeling overwhelmed and frustrated by conflicting health noise and is ready for something she can actually trust. Every week, we have honest, science-backed conversations about your health, your hormones, your brain, your body, and everything in between. No fluff, no fear-mongering, just the truth. Because understanding your body is the most powerful thing you can do for yourself. A table full of experts built for the curious girl who wants the truth. So welcome. Your seat is waiting for you. It's not weakness. It's not that your body can't cope. It's your nervous system doing exactly what it was designed to do. So no, grief isn't just an emotion. It's not just sadness. It's your entire nervous system reorganizing around the loss that you just experienced. Anger lives in the liver, fear lives in the kidneys, joy lives in the heart, and grief lives in the lungs. The heaviness in your chest, the shallow breathing, the labored breathing at rest, but also a little bit harder during exercise. The sigh, the way that a wave of grief can physically take your breath away. Grief is like a rock in your pocket, and you wonder if that grief is ever going to go away or that sensation is ever going away. And what happens is you just get stronger dealing with it. Grief elevates stress hormones, suppresses the immune system, drives systemic inflammation, and disrupts your hormonal regulation. This is the biology underneath the instinct to be with people when you're experiencing grief. You're not just seeking comfort, you're likely regulating your nervous system with these oxytocin-inducing activities and interactions. Joy shared is joy multiplied, and grief shared is grief divided. You know that feeling where everything on the outside looks the same? You're showing up to work, you're hanging out with your friends, you're trying to show up as your normal self. When in reality, underneath it all is this heavy weight, this missing piece of you as you go through this process of grief. It's not necessarily weakness. It's not that your body can't cope. It's your nervous system doing exactly what it was designed to do. Welcome back to Wellness Fixes the Pod. I'm your host, Dr. Kelsy Vick, a board-certified orthopedic doctor of physical therapy and a pelvic floor physical therapist. And to be completely honest with you guys, you know a lot of my episodes are inspired by conversations or events happening in my own life. And right now, I'm currently going through my own grief journey as someone very close, very special to me has recently passed away. And I know a lot of us have experienced grief, and it's not something that we really like to talk about, but I was very curious on the science of it all, the neuroscience of it all, how it shows up physically. We had Dr. Felice Chan on the podcast back almost a year ago, and she actually posted something on social media that sort of pushed me to do this episode. And she was talking about the traditional Chinese medicine approach to grief and where you actually feel that. And as I have been going through this grief journey, I've been feeling it show up in my body in certain places. And her post on social media really put words to the sensations that I was feeling in my own body. So today we're going to dive into grief, the neuroscience behind grief, how our bodies actually handle it from more my realm of expertise and the Western medicine approach, but then also the Eastern medicine approach, the traditional Chinese medicine approach that Dr. Felice Chan introduced me to. And we'll also cover a little bit of the faith aspect because I've realized that I have so much hope in something bigger than myself, that this person who I am dearly missing is somewhere even better than here. And that gives me a lot of peace despite the grief. So we will cover all of that. And if you guys are going through your own grief journey, just know that I am right there with you. I know we have all probably gone through some sort of grief in our lives, and I wanted to cover this episode as I am currently going through that in my own life. So most of us have been taught to think of grief as an emotional experience that happens to have some physical side effects. Maybe trouble sleeping, maybe losing your appetite. But the research actually tells a more complete and validating story than that. A 2025 review that was published synthesized a lot of peer-reviewed research on the neurobiology of grief. And they found that grief was not only a psychological phenomenon, but it involves distinct neurological processing that affects our emotional regulation, our ability to executive plan and make those higher level decisions. And it also affects our ability to regulate stress. When we are experiencing grief, neural alterations are observed in key brain areas associated with emotional processing, memory, and attachment, including the amygdala, hippocampus, and the prefrontal cortex. They found that grief actually changes your brain. The amygdala, or your brain's threat detection center, goes into overdrive. The prefrontal cortex, involved in those higher level decisions, rational thought, and emotional regulation, is functionally impaired. This is sometimes why decisions feel impossible during grief, and why emotional reactions might feel way extreme compared to how you would normally respond to something. It can also help explain why concentrating is so hard. It's not that you're falling apart, it's just that your brain is genuinely reorganized around the absence. A systematic review of neuroimaging studies published in 2025 examining the neural correlates of bereavement found consistent disruptions in emotion regulation, reward processing, and cognitive control networks, with heightened neural reactivity to grief-related stimuli, particularly in the amygdala and the anterior cingulate cortex. I want to zone in a little bit on the reward processing part of that study, because it likely explains something that you yourself have experienced during grief and can't quite put a name to. The way grief affects our reward processing presents itself in our lives in that activities or social interactions that we used to previously enjoy, hobbies that we used to previously enjoy, don't feel as fulfilling anymore. Different foods, socializing, and activities register as slightly flat. That's just your reward network being disrupted by loss. So no, grief isn't just an emotion. It's not just sadness. It's your entire nervous system reorganizing around the loss that you just experienced. Your brain's threat center is on high alert. The part of your brain that handles rationality and decision-making is relatively offline compared to your normal. And the system that processes reward and pleasure is disrupted. You're not falling apart. You're doing one of the most neurobiologically demanding things your brain is ever required to do. Now, that's more of the Western medicine lens. Let's dive into the traditional Chinese medicine lens and what I learned from Dr. Felice Chan. Our Western neuroscience and research has spent the last decades trying to understand the brain and test and measure. And a lot of their findings have correlated with some of what Eastern medicine has just been practicing for years and years. Western neuroscience has found chest heaviness, difficulty breathing, this overall contracted feeling within your body. And traditional Chinese medicine has understood all of these responses centuries ago. Not necessarily with brain imaging, but just with understanding and observation, and having a holistic view on how the body and emotions are not two separate systems, but one. So Dr. Felice Chan had posted about grief being a sensation felt in the lungs, where if you're having difficulty with breathing or chest heaviness, a lot of the time that's where grief lies. And it really resonated with me because as I've been experiencing this, I know that I feel that heaviness, that pressure within my lungs, that difficulty breathing, shallow breathing, labored breathing. Exercise feels a little bit harder. And so her post really resonated with me, and I wanted to dive into some of the more science-based research behind it. So this is not my expertise. This is something I have learned from Dr. Felice Chan and then had wanted to dive into a little bit more on the traditional Chinese medicine side of grief. So in TCM, every emotion is associated with a specific organ system. Anger lives in the liver, fear lives in the kidneys, joy lives in the heart, and grief lives in the lungs. Grief is associated with the lungs and what they call the metal element. The lungs are the body's first line of defense against the outside world, responsible for circulating qi or vital energy throughout the body. When we experience loss or sadness, the lung energy naturally contracts. When grief lingers or goes unexpressed, it can weaken the lungs and lead to fatigue, low immunity, or shallow breathing. I pulled that from a blog on emotions and TCM from Encircle Acupuncture. But if we think about that for a moment and think about what grief actually feels like in your body, in my body, the heaviness in your chest, the shallow breathing, the labored breathing at rest, but also a little bit harder during exercise, the sigh, the way that a wave of grief can physically take your breath away. Traditional Chinese medicine just named that lung grief connection centuries before we had imaging machines. And the Western research on grief's physiological effects on breathing and immunity and chest heaviness mirrors a lot of the things that TCM has taught for millennia and millennia. This is what I think is really cool, is that there are multiple pathways to the same result, where we are seeing some of these things on imaging studies and utilizing highly controlled ways of researching the brain and grief and emotions. And TCM has been practiced for thousands of years and has noted some of the changes that Western medicine is now seeing in their research. So I like that we're able to come to the same conclusion from maybe two separate lenses of thinking. So here's another little summary from an article called Understanding Grief with Chinese Medicine, Lung and Letting Go. And I'll leave all of the links to all of these resources in the show notes below if you want to take a look. Both the more Western medicine research and the TCM blogs and articles and research that I'm getting some of these excerpts from. In Chinese medicine, grief is assigned to the metal element, which stands for structure, clarity, and letting go. The lung is described as the organ of exchange, of farewell, and of dignity. It receives what is fresh and gives back what has been used up. Grief belongs to the lungs because it is one of the few emotions that does not discharge outwardly, but sinks inward. Grief contracts qi. It slows, constricts, holds, and when grief cannot be felt or expressed, when it is suppressed, rationalized, or pushed through, TCM describes this as stagnation of the lung qi. It might include a feeling of a lump in the throat, difficulty swallowing, a feeling of oppression or distension in the chest, slight breathlessness, sighing, sadness, and a depressed mood. And although this isn't my expertise and I'm getting all of this from people who are, I think it's just this really validating experience going through my own grief journey, that there are things happening within my brain and there are things happening within my body, no matter the lens that I look at it with. And sometimes I can just have better language to explain what I'm going through if I look at these two separate lenses. And having TCM and Dr. Felice Chan make that connection between grief and the lungs really helped validating my own physicality of where I'm feeling that grief experience in my chest. A 2025 case report published in a peer-reviewed psychiatry journal explored the relationship between profound grief and pulmonary function, noting that TCM describes correlations between mental states and physical organs, specifically identifying grief and sadness as correlated to the lung, and that TCM informs that psychological issues can manifest as physiological dysfunction in the related organs. Here's one of the things that I also love the most about the TCM approach to grief, and something Dr. Felice Chan touched on in her episode almost a year ago. Western medicine tends to ask, how do we resolve grief, move through it, and get to the other side? TCM asks, what do you need to be able to breathe again? If you truly have this stagnation in your body, what can we do to help that flow resume? We're not necessarily trying to get rid of grief. We're trying to restore that flow and give that lung qi somewhere to move. So how does TCM approach treatment for grief? They view breathing as medicine, which as a PT and especially a pelvic floor PT, this is huge. I also view breathing as medicine and a lot of other things, but they view breathing as medicine. Practices that promote healthy breathing are considered essential for the processing of grief. Deep breathing and meditation can help improve lung capacity, improve qi flow, and release emotional stress. On the Western medicine side of things, diaphragmatic breathing, that really deep 360-degree umbrella breath, that full exhale, has also been shown to be one of the best ways to tap into that parasympathetic, that rest, digest, vagal tone. I'm picturing that handshake emoji where it's like TCM and Western medicine just like handshaking, saying, we both got this. TCM also heavily utilizes fuel as medicine, specifically warming foods and nourishment. In TCM, certain foods are found specifically beneficial for grief. White-colored foods, pears, radishes, daikon, align with the metal element and help nourish lung function. Staying well hydrated with warm fluids like herbal teas and soups is also recommended, as the metal element is associated with dryness. Perhaps the most important thing TCM offers around grief isn't an herb or an acupuncture point, it's more of a permission structure. The metal element's lesson is in letting go, but you can't let go of something unless you've fully held it. TCM doesn't rush grief. It asks the body to breathe through it. And in a culture that is deeply uncomfortable with sitting in that loss, that permission of allowing it to just be might be one of the best treatments for those of us who are experiencing grief. One of my favorite quotes, and I forget where I read it, it almost seems like a Winnie the Pooh quote, but it talks about how grief is like a rock in your pocket, and you wonder if that grief is ever going to go away or that sensation is ever going away. And what happens is you just get stronger dealing with it. So I view TCM with that picture in mind, where you have this possible rock in your pocket and it feels really heavy at first. But the more you sit with it, the more you work with it, the more you let it become a part of you, and that process of allowing, the stronger you get to carry it. It's not that the rock lightens or that the rock gets smaller. It's just that you get stronger handling it. So although the TCM lens and the Western medicine lens might speak different languages, I find it very comforting that they arrive at the same conclusion and give language to something that I think a lot of us have experienced. So how does grief actually affect our immunity and our hormonal response? Have you ever noticed that you get sick after something hard happens, or that your body feels physically heavy in a way that has nothing to do with being tired? In that same research published in 2025, that review of peer-reviewed research, they found that hormonal dysregulation, specifically elevated cortisol and oxytocin levels, play a significant role in the physiological response to grief. Cortisol elevation is particularly well documented when it comes to grief. Studies of bereaved spouses show that cortisol levels rise and remain elevated for the first 6 months of bereavement. And when the death was unexpected, cortisol levels were even higher. What makes me pause on this study is I wonder, had someone known that the passing of their loved one was coming soon, if their cortisol levels were higher even before the passing. So I wonder if it's not necessarily the length of time after someone passed away, but the whole process, because people can grieve while someone is still living, especially if that person is just taking the time to go through the process of their bodies shutting down. This is the part I want to make special note of, but chronically elevated cortisol is the problem, not cortisol in general. Chronically elevated or chronically depressed cortisol. We want those nice peaks and valleys throughout. We don't want it to be chronically one way or chronically the other. So cortisol is not the bad guy. I call her the misunderstood mean girl. But when we experience grief, that baseline level might elevate, which can have a lot of the downstream hormonal effects that elevated cortisol and elevated stress has on our bodies. Chronically elevated cortisol affects our immune function, sleep quality, inflammation, and in women specifically, our hormonal balance. If you think back to our spring cleaning liver episode, there is a relationship between cortisol and estrogen. Sustained cortisol elevation disrupts the hormonal environment of the menstrual cycle, which is why many women notice changes in their menstrual cycle during periods of intense stress or grief. A review published in Psychosomatic Medicine examining 41 years of research on bereavement and immune function found that bereaved people demonstrate higher levels of systemic inflammation, maladaptive immune cell gene expression, and lower antibody response to vaccinations compared to non-bereaved peers. When the immune system is suppressed during grief, inflammation increases. And when inflammation increases, musculoskeletal pain, joint pain, fatigue, and other physical symptoms can all be added to the grief process. So the chest tightness, the heaviness in the limbs, the headaches, the digestive disruption, the menstrual cycle irregularities, the way your whole body might feel like you're moving through something so thick and viscous. These are the measurable physiological consequences of one of the most stressful experiences the human body can experience. So when people say losing their loved one broke their heart, they're not entirely wrong. Grief elevates stress hormones, suppresses the immune system, drives systemic inflammation, and disrupts your hormonal regulation. The physical symptoms of grief are very real, and as your body processes it all, just remember that it's doing an enormous task, one of the most physiologically demanding tasks that the brain and body can go through. Now, most of this research has been done on people who have lost a spouse, but I think it can be applied to a lot of us who lose a loved one who we are super close with. There is different forms of love and connection amongst spouses, amongst family members, amongst siblings, amongst friends, and just because you might be experiencing some of these things when you have lost someone who is not a spouse does not make it any less real. One of the most universal complaints of grief is disrupted sleep. And it's also one of the least talked about. Honestly, I think grief in general is not very talked about. I have not listened to a single podcast on grief. So if this is your first, welcome. This is also my first of presenting this information and diving into the science behind it. But sleep is one of the most common complaints, and disrupted sleep is one of the most common complaints of grief. A systematic review of sleep disturbances and bereavement found a strong association between grief intensity and sleep problems, with higher grief intensity consistently associated with more frequent and severe sleep difficulties. Around 80% of people with complicated grief experience longer-term poor sleep. And unfortunately, this is one of those cyclical things where grief disrupts sleep, but a lack of sleep also makes grief harder to process. Research found that those who had persistent sleep challenges before losing someone were at higher risk for developing complicated grief after loss, and bereaved college students who experienced insomnia showed more severe symptoms of complicated grief than those whose sleep wasn't disrupted. If you listened back to our glymphatic episode, I'll leave all of the links to all of these episodes that I'm mentioning, the Dr. Felice Chan one, the liver episode, the glymphatic episode. But if you listen to our glymphatic episode, you already know that REM sleep is when the brain processes emotional memory. And the glymphatic system does much of its cleaning work, which is like the cleansing system for the brain. And go figure, grief specifically disrupts this REM part of our sleep cycle. When REM sleep is disrupted, whether by insomnia or grief, emotional memory reconsolidation is impaired. In the context of grief, insufficient REM sleep can interfere with the brain's ability to integrate the reality of loss. Aspects of the loss may remain emotionally unprocessed because of this poor sleep. So grief and sleep have a complicated relationship. Grief disrupts our sleep, and disrupted sleep affects our grief and our ability to process grief. Now, what can actually help grief? And let's be very clear about this. It's not a problem that has to be solved. It's a process that we need to go through and experience. We've talked about how TCM prioritizes this process of allowing grief to sit with us, sit within us, and processing it that way. We've talked about how we need to understand the full loss experience, and if we have disrupted sleep, we don't necessarily fully process it. So it's not this problem that needs to be solved or this experience that needs to be rushed through, but there are some things that we can do to help us process that grief in a healthy way. First action, protect your sleep. As we talked about, sleep and grief have a complex relationship and both impact the other. So the more we can prioritize sleep and have healthy sleep hygiene, sleep environment, the better. Really working to limit that blue light exposure right before you go to bed, and remembering that circadian rhythm is influenced not only at night, but also with the morning sunlight viewing. So if you're having trouble sleeping, we've done, I think, a few episodes on sleep, definitely 2 when we talk about cleaning up our sleep hygiene and what that entails. But in order to get a good night's sleep, we have to have a good waking routine as well. So if you're someone who is experiencing a lot of disrupted sleep because of grief, really trying to be a little bit more disciplined in the routines that can help that sleep. So getting morning sunlight, limiting blue light in the evening, alcohol, limiting alcohol, and those other sort of later food and drinks, caffeine that might affect your sleep later on. Research has found that protecting sleep is one of the most clinically important things a grieving person can do. Keeping a consistent sleep and wake time, reducing blue light exposure, morning sunlight, reducing alcohol, and creating a sleep environment that feels very restful are all some of the tips to help protect your sleep. Action item number 2, move your body. A 2021 systematic review published in Sports Medicine examined physical activity as a support for grief outcomes in bereaved individuals, found evidence that physical activity can provide benefit for the physical health and psychological well-being of those who have been bereaved. It's not about fitness. It's not about improving strength or flexibility or cardiovascular endurance. It's more of an outlet and giving your nervous system a way to discharge some of that extra cortisol and stress hormones that grief might generate. Things like walking, yoga, gentle movement, they're not necessarily performative, they're prescriptive. Action number 3, lean into real connection. research highlights the role that oxytocin plays in the physiological response to grief. And oxytocin is released through genuine social connection, physical touch, and face-to-face interaction with people that are safe, not just random people. You want to feel supported when you are using social interaction as a way to help with your grief. This is the biology underneath the instinct to be with people when you're experiencing grief. You're not just seeking comfort, you're likely regulating your nervous system with these oxytocin-inducing activities and interactions. Being with people who don't require you to explain yourself or perform has measurable physiological benefits on your stress hormones. Action number 4, breathe intentionally. Connecting back to what TCM has taught for centuries, grief and the lungs go hand in hand. Deep, intentional, diaphragmatic breathing and meditation are two of the best things we can do to breathe intentionally to help us process our grief, not only psychologically and how our nervous system is able to regulate, but also physically. And lastly, we can tie it back to the TCM, the process of allowing, but the permission to be inefficient. Your brain is trying to process things. It's not functioning at 100% like it might when you are not going through this grieving process. And giving yourself that grace is one of the best things you can do. Before we close, I want to talk about a few things that have really helped me with my own grief journey and processing grief. I listened to Father Mike on Ascension Press, I think Sunday Homilies with Father Mike. It's a podcast, but he is a Catholic priest who records his homilies every week. And leading up to the loss of my loved one, he had a lot of these very beneficial episodes. So I'll leave the link to some of those episodes below. But a few of the things that really helped me and are continuing to help me is the phrase, especially when this loved one of mine had passed away, he had talked about that joy shared is joy multiplied and grief shared is grief divided. So that ties back into the emotional processing and the social connection needed during grief. I remember the last time I lost someone super important and impactful in my life. I think sharing grief with other people is one of the best things you can do. And being even in the same house as people also grieving the same person is one of the most healing things that I've experienced and have continued to experience during this own sort of grief process. But I really loved what he said, that joy shared is joy multiplied and grief shared is grief divided. It makes it a little easier to bear. One of the other things that he talked about was this eternal perspective. And I found that throughout this whole process, I know that I have hope that this loved one of mine is in a better place. She has gone to her eternal home. And as a Christian, I strongly believe that she is in a much better place than we can ever imagine here on earth. And Father Mike had done an episode a while back that talked about how someone should try and think about grief and losing someone. And he said a lot of the times we can be tempted to grieve what that person might miss here on earth, the person that has gone into eternal life. We might be tempted to say, oh, I wish so-and-so were here for this. I wish I could have experienced this with this person. And it really comforted me because he was saying that it's okay to miss that person, but we shouldn't think about what that person is missing here on earth, since what they are experiencing in heaven is so much better. And what they are experiencing there makes their life completely more full, their soul completely more full. And that phrase has really helped because it might sound a little heartless to think, oh, why can't we think about that? Why can't I think about what that person is missing? My sister's wedding last weekend is one of those examples. I know my sister was probably thinking, gosh, I wish this person was here. But for me, it's been very comforting to have that perspective and know that whatever I think that person is missing here on earth, it is nothing compared to eternal life and what she's experiencing right now. So I think from the outside, that perspective can sound a little heartless, but from someone who is grieving, it is so comforting to catch myself whenever I try and think about that and say, no, Kelsy, that is, you can miss the person, but you can't think about what that person is missing here on earth because they're experiencing so much greater in heaven. So those are just two of the things, I guess, two of the main things that I've been repeating to myself. I have leaned heavily on my faith. And so if you've made it this far, if you are also a faithful person and a Christian, I hope those things resonate with you. I'd love for you guys to share with me anything that's also helped you. If you are going through a grief journey, or if you have, I've also heard just being able to talk about the person and share memories, all of that has been so helpful. And I think that partly relates to that grief shared is grief divided, where we are able to celebrate the life that someone lived. So thank you guys for joining me with this harder episode to talk about, but I hope you guys learned a lot about grief, just like I learned a lot about grief. And again, if you are going through your own grief journey, I am right there with you. If you're listening to this later, I hope a lot of these tips and reasonings for things really help you as you process the loss of a loved one or your own grief due to whatever circumstance in your life. But thank you guys for joining me. I'll leave all the links to all of the research articles and episodes below. But I hope you guys enjoyed this episode, and I'll see you guys again on the next episode of Wellness Fixes the Pod.